The Boy Who Survived Auschwitz. The story of Thomas Buergenthal. Imagine being 10 years old. You should be worried about school, about friends, about playing, maybe about the things a child normally thinks about when they wake up in the morning. Now imagine waking up without knowing whether your parents will still be alive by the end of the day. Imagine living in a place where your name no longer matters, where your age can determine whether you live or die, where a child is no longer treated as a child. And imagine that, after surviving all of this, you somehow managed to build an entire life. A life so extraordinary that decades later, that same child would become a judge at one of the world's most important international institutions. This is not a fictional story. This is the story of Thomas Buergenthal, a Jewish boy who survived the Holocaust, a boy who lived through ghettos, forced labor camps, Auschwitz, and a death march. A boy who lost his father, who was separated from his mother, who spent months not knowing whether she was alive, and who, many years later, would dedicate his life to international law and human rights. This is the story of Thomas Buergenthal. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that, when it all began, he was not a hero. He was simply a child. Chapter 1. Before Everything. Thomas Buergenthal was born on May 11, 1934, in New Bochnia, in what was then Czechoslovakia. His parents, Mundek and Gerda, were Jewish and had left Germany after the Nazis came to power. They believed they were leaving danger behind. But the danger was growing. The Nazi regime made no secret of its intention to persecute Jews. Discrimination increased. Freedoms disappeared. And little by little, what had initially seemed like political persecution began to completely transform the lives of millions of people. Thomas's family eventually left the region and settled in different parts of Czechoslovakia. In 1938, they were living in Žilina, but the situation continued to deteriorate. The persecution of Jews intensified, and Thomas's parents decided to flee once again. This time, they went to Poland. Their hope was eventually to reach Great Britain. It was a plan to escape, a plan to save the family. But there was a problem. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The war had begun, and the possibility of simply leaving Europe disappeared. Thomas was only 5 years old. He was still too young to fully understand what was happening, but his childhood was already being destroyed. The family eventually arrived in Kielce, Poland, and it was there that Thomas's life began to change irreversibly. Chapter 2. The Ghetto. In 1941, German authorities forced the Jews of Kielce to live inside a ghetto. Around 25,000 Jews were confined to that area. Entire families were torn from their homes. People lost their jobs, they lost their freedom, they lost the right to decide where they could go, and most importantly, they lost their sense of security. For a child like Thomas, the world became defined by fences, soldiers, and fear. But he still had a family. His father, his mother, and Thomas. As long as they were together, there was something that kept them human. Some sense of normality. Until in August 1942, that normality disappeared. The Nazis began liquidating the Kielce ghetto. Thousands of people were deported. Around 20,000 Jews were sent to Treblinka. Treblinka was not simply a labor camp. It was an extermination center. Most of the people sent there would never survive. Thomas and his parents managed to escape that deportation. But escaping did not mean being free. The family was sent to a forced labor camp in Kielce. And Thomas, still a child, began living as a prisoner. From that moment on, survival would depend not only on luck, it would also depend on learning, very quickly, the rules of a world that should never have existed. Chapter 3. A Child in the Camp. There is something particularly difficult to understand when we think about the Holocaust. It was not only adults. It was not only soldiers. It was not only men capable of fighting. There were children, very young children, children who could not understand why they were being persecuted. Thomas was one of them. He had to learn to observe, to listen, to avoid attracting attention, to understand when it was dangerous to speak, to recognize the mood of the guards, to find small opportunities to get food, to stay alive. In the labor camp, he also witnessed things that no child should ever have to see. One of the most important moments in his survival came when he managed to escape a massacre of children. Thomas would later remember that period as a sequence of events in which small circumstances made an enormous difference. Sometimes survival depended on something he could not control, a decision made by someone else, an order that was never given, a selection that never happened, a transport that arrived at a particular moment, a door that remained open, an opportunity. That is why, years later, Thomas would use a very simple word to describe his story: luck, not because his survival was easy, but because, among the millions of people who were murdered, he was one of those who had an opportunity to remain alive. Chapter 4. Auschwitz. In August 1944, Thomas and his parents were deported to Auschwitz. Thomas was 10 years old. 10. It is difficult to imagine what it means for a child that age to arrive at Auschwitz. Today, we know what that name means. We know what happened there. We know that Auschwitz became one of the main symbols of the Holocaust. But Thomas did not understand the full reality of what awaited him. He was arriving at a place that had been built to destroy human beings. And there was a cruel rule. Jewish children of Thomas's age were generally not considered useful as workers. Many were murdered soon after arriving. At Auschwitz, newly arrived prisoners often went through selections. Some were sent to work. Others were sent directly to their deaths. But when Thomas's transport arrived, something extraordinary happened. There was no selection at that moment, and that saved his life. Thomas survived the arrival. His mother was sent to the women's section. Thomas and his father initially remained together in the men's section, but that separation would not last. Soon, Thomas would also be separated from his father. Think about that. First, you lose your home, then your city, then your freedom. Then you begin losing people you know. And eventually, the moment comes when your own parents are taken away from you. Thomas was 10 years old. Chapter 5, The Father. Thomas's father, Mundek, had been a constant presence throughout that journey. He was his father. He was one of the few people who still connected Thomas to the life that had existed before the war. But Auschwitz destroyed that connection. Father and son were separated. Thomas would never again have the security of being beside him. And eventually, the situation became even worse. Thomas's father would not survive. He was killed shortly before liberation. Thomas did not know this at the time. And that is one of the cruelest aspects of the experience of many survivors. Absence did not necessarily come with an explanation. You simply stopped seeing someone. And you did not know whether that person was alive. You did not know where they were. You did not know whether they would return. Thomas continued surviving. But now he was almost completely alone. Chapter 6. Survival. When we think about survival, we often imagine great acts of courage. Someone confronting a soldier. Someone escaping through a forest. Someone leading a revolt. But for Thomas, survival often meant something much simpler. Continuing to wake up, continuing to walk, continuing to find food, continuing to avoid dangerous situations, continuing to observe, continuing to wait, and, above all, continuing to live. He was a child surrounded by adults, but childhood no longer existed. The war had transformed a child into someone who had to think constantly about survival. And then at the beginning of 1945, the situation at Auschwitz changed. The Soviet army was advancing. The Nazis began evacuating the camp. But liberation did not come immediately. Before liberation came one of the most brutal experiences Thomas would ever face. The Death March. Chapter 7. The Death March. In January 1945, Thomas was removed from Auschwitz along with other prisoners. The Nazis were abandoning the camp, but they did not want to leave all those prisoners behind. Thousands were forced to march. Those who could not keep up were killed. The cold was extreme. The prisoners were weak. Many were sick, and there was almost no food. Thomas was a child, and he was walking through a situation in which many adults would not survive. He had arrived at Auschwitz only months earlier. Now he was being taken away. He did not know where he was going. He did not know whether he would see his mother again. He did not know whether his father was still alive. He did not know whether he would make it to the next day. The march took him away from Auschwitz. Later, Thomas was transported by train to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany, and once again, he would have to survive. Chapter 8. Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was another Nazi concentration camp. Thomas arrived there during the final months of the war. The Nazis were losing, but that did not mean the prisoners were safe. The camp remained a place of hunger, disease, violence, and death. Thomas was becoming weaker and weaker. But something had changed. The war was coming to an end. The Allied armies were advancing. The Nazi regime was collapsing. And then came April 1945. Soviet forces were approaching. The SS guards began abandoning the camp. Thomas was among the prisoners who remained in Sachsenhausen. And finally, it happened. Liberation. Thomas had survived. But surviving did not mean that his story was over. In fact, for him, a new story was beginning. Chapter 9. A Boy Without a Country. When Thomas was liberated, he was approximately 11 years old. Think about that age again. 11 years old. While other children were returning to their homes, Thomas had no home to return to. Europe had been destroyed. His family had been destroyed. Millions of Jews had been murdered. The war was over, but for survivors, the world was still filled with questions. Where were their relatives? Who had survived? Where should they go? Where would they live? What would they do? Thomas was placed in a Jewish orphanage, and that was where a new chapter of his life began. He still did not know whether he would find his mother. That answer would take time. A long time. Chapter 10. His mother. After the war, a search began. Survivors searched for survivors. Families searched for families. People searched for names on lists. They searched for information. They searched for any sign that someone they loved might still be alive. Thomas also needed to discover what had happened to his mother. And then, after approximately a year and a half, something happened that seemed impossible. Thomas found his mother. Gerda was alive. Mother and son were finally together again. After everything. After the ghetto. After the labor camp. After Auschwitz. After the separation. After the death march. After liberation. After months of not knowing whether the other was alive. They were together. But there was an absence that could not be ignored. Mundek was not there. Thomas's father had not survived. The family had been partially reunited, but it could never be the same again. Chapter 11. Starting over. Thomas and his mother spent some time in post-war Germany. He needed to rebuild his life. But something extraordinary was happening. The child who had been treated by the Nazi regime as someone who should not exist was still alive, and he would continue growing. Thomas eventually left Europe. In 1951, at the age of 17, he immigrated to the United States. Think about the distance between that boy in Auschwitz and the young man arriving in America. At 10 years old, he was imprisoned in a camp. At 11, he was a survivor who did not know what his future would look like. At 17, he was beginning a new life on another continent. But the story would not end there. Chapter 12. The law Thomas decided to study. And eventually he entered the world of law. It was not an ordinary choice. His own life had been shaped by the absence of rights. He had seen what happens when a government decides that certain human beings do not deserve the same rights as everyone else. He had seen a society turn prejudice into laws, laws into persecution, persecution into imprisonment, imprisonment into deportation, and deportation into mass murder. Perhaps that is why his professional journey took on such profound meaning. Thomas became a law professor and a specialist in international law and human rights. He held academic positions at American universities, and he worked for decades in institutions connected to the protection of human rights. But then something happened that seems almost unbelievable when we remember where he had started. Thomas Buergenthal became a judge. Not just any judge. He served on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and later he became a judge of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The child who had once been a prisoner of the Nazis was now part of an international institution dedicated to applying law between nations. The boy who had lost his fundamental rights became someone who would work precisely on issues related to human rights. Chapter 13. The Return. There is a powerful image when we think about Thomas's life. On one side, a boy, 10 years old, a prisoner, without freedom, without control over his own destiny. On the other side, decades later, a grown man sitting as a judge in The Hague. It is difficult to imagine a greater contrast, but perhaps that is exactly the most important part of the story. Thomas did not spend his entire life simply telling people what had happened. He transformed his experience into work, into education, into law, into the defense of others. He dedicated much of his life to human rights and to preventing future atrocities. His past did not disappear, but he managed to build something on top of the ruins left by the war. Chapter 14. Why a Lucky Child? Thomas wrote his memoirs in a book called A Lucky Child. The title may seem strange. How can you call a child who went through Auschwitz lucky? How can you call someone lucky who lost his father? Who was separated from his mother? Who lived in ghettos and camps? The answer lies precisely in the complexity of his survival. Thomas recognized that he had been lucky at several moments. He was lucky because his transport arrived at Auschwitz without an immediate selection. He was lucky because he escaped situations that killed other children. He was lucky because he survived the death march. He was lucky because he survived Sachsenhausen. And he was lucky because his mother survived as well. But there is another way to look at that word. Perhaps lucky does not mean that his life was easy. It simply means that among millions of people who were never given that opportunity, Thomas had the chance to continue living, and he made something of that chance. Chapter 15. What remained? The Holocaust killed millions of people. Every one of those people had a name, a family, a story, a childhood, plans, fears, love, hope. When we hear very large numbers, there is a danger that they lose their meaning. If someone says millions of people were murdered, we know it was a tragedy, but it is difficult to imagine millions. Thomas offers us another perspective. One child, one name, one family, one story. Thomas could have disappeared among those millions. He could have become just another forgotten name. But he survived. And his story allows us to understand something essential. The Holocaust did not happen to numbers. It happened to people. Chapter 16. The Boy and the Judge. Perhaps the most powerful way to understand Thomas's life is to place two images side by side. The first, a 10-year-old boy arriving at Auschwitz. The second, a grown man sitting at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Between those two images is an entire lifetime. There is the death of his father, the separation from his mother, the hunger, the camps, the march, liberation, the orphanage, the search for his family, immigration, education, his career, the law, and finally, a position of enormous international responsibility. It is a journey that does not erase the suffering. Nothing could erase it, but it shows that the Nazis did not succeed in determining the ending of that boy's story. They tried to decide who could live. They tried to decide who deserved to exist. They tried to destroy his family. But Thomas survived, and he built a life that the Nazi regime would never have imagined. Chapter 17. The Legacy. Thomas Buergenthal died on May 29, 2023, at the age of 89. But his story remains, not simply because he survived Auschwitz, but because he decided to do something with the life he had managed to preserve. He could have spent his life trying to forget. He could have avoided speaking about the past, but he wrote his memoirs. He spoke about the Holocaust. He studied law. He worked in human rights, and he built a career dedicated precisely to the principles that had been destroyed during his childhood. The idea that everyone has rights, regardless of religion, nationality, origin, or any other characteristic. His legacy is especially powerful because as a child, he experienced what happens when a society decides to take those rights away from certain groups of people. Final, the boy who should not have survived. Now come back with me to that first moment. Imagine a 10-year-old boy. He is in Auschwitz. He does not know what tomorrow will bring. He does not know where his mother is. He does not know whether his father is alive. He does not know whether he will ever leave that place. He does not know that decades later, his name will be known internationally. He does not know that he will study law. He does not know that he will live in the United States. He does not know that he will become a professor. He does not know that he will become a judge. He does not know that he will reach The Hague. He only knows that he has to survive. And perhaps that is the most human part of this entire story. Thomas did not survive because he knew he would have an extraordinary future. He survived because he kept living one day at a time. And that boy, who was supposed to become just another victim of the Holocaust, became a living witness that those who tried to destroy him did not get to write the ending of his story. The story of Thomas Buergenthal is not only a story about Auschwitz. It is a story about what can happen after Auschwitz. It is about rebuilding a life after losing almost everything. It is about turning memory into responsibility. And perhaps, most importantly, it is about something very simple. A human being can be placed in the most inhuman circumstances imaginable, and even then, their story does not have to end there. Thomas survived. His mother survived. His memory survived. And today, when we hear his story, that boy stops being just a statistic. He becomes a person again. Thomas, a son, a student, a professor, a judge, a survivor, a man who lived long enough to look back and tell the world, I was there, I survived, and this is my story. If you have made it this far, perhaps you have realized that stories like this are not simply stories about the past. They are reminders. Reminders of how far hatred can take a society. And reminders that the life of a single person can carry a memory that should never be forgotten. If this is the kind of story you want to find here on Hollow Knight, don't let this story end with this video. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not just to support the channel, but so we can continue bringing you real stories of people who lived through events that seem almost impossible. Stories that may have been forgotten, but that still have something important to teach us. Because some stories deserve to be remembered, and some people deserve to have their names continue to be spoken. Thomas Buergenthal was one of them, and this was the story of the boy who survived Auschwitz.